SANDHAN, All Gujarat Integrated Classroom.
સેટેલાઇટના માધ્યમથી જોડતી કડી એટલે સંધાન.
Good afternoon. I am C.B. Anthony, Associate Professor, J.Z. Shah Arts and H.P. Desai Commerce College, Amroli, Surat. I would like to take you to the world of Robert Browning today, the poetry of Robert Browning. Before going into the poems of Robert Browning, let us go a little back into the history of literature. Let us start from neoclassicism, the neoclassical poetry, the conventional neoclassicism. The poems which were of the diction, the high seriousness of the typical neoclassical poetry. From there, the movement to romanticism. Romantic poets like Wordsworth, Byron, Shelley, Keats, etc. Now, just remember the change in the attitude of the poets. The neoclassical poetry that was meant for the well-educated, the rich, the aristocrats. Whereas the romantic poets, they wrote for the common man. The language was simple and the subject matter was also simple. Everyone could understand, any man could understand. So that is romanticism, romantic poetry. Now the association with nature in romantic poetry, think about it, the association with nature. Wordsworth and the element of nature, people, the romantic writers, they depended on nature, they found God in nature. There was a connecting link between man and nature. That is romantic poetry. Man finding himself in the lap of nature, nature appearing as a mother, a protector, a giver, and nature is everything for the romantic poet. And then from there, step further, we have the Victorian poets and Robert Browning. Now let us see how he deals with nature and the other topics which he has. Now when we talk about Browning, the words that come to our mind are a few. For example, love, God, nature, poet, painting, music. So we can sum up the poetry of Robert Browning in these words. This is Robert Browning. Now a little glance at the background or the social background. The 19th century England, the Industrial Revolution and the aftermath of the Industrial Revolution, the changes in society, the changes in literature, the changes in the vision, the attitude and the moral decline. So all this had an immediate effect on literature too. And we have the other writers of the Victorian era who have very clearly portrayed the differences that had occurred in the period, the Victorian period. Now let us see on the screen Robert Browning, a poet who lived between 1812 and 1889. The poet who has contributed a lot to the world of literature. And people love the poet, love to read his poems because of so many things. There are so many aspects of his poetry. Now he was born in a place near London and he did not have much formal education. But his father's library that was the background. He had gained that interest in reading from his father's library. He read from his very childhood. He read poems, he read books on religion and whatever was available with his father. That enriched him, that gave him the impetus, that encouraged him, and by the age of 17 he had decided to take up poetry as his career. And his continuous reading made him a great thinker, and from a thinker he became a poet. And it did not take much time for him to come out as a well-known poet. And he is a contemporary of Lord Tennyson. Now, Robert Browning is a poet of love and hope. As I told you earlier, love, hope, and God. These are three key words in his poems. We can say that Robert Browning is a poet of love, as we say Robert Browning is a poet of God. Now, in Christianity, in Christian background, God is love. God has created man out of love. He created man in his own image and the best of his creations, that is man. But man is not able to see God. Man has to feel God. Man has to believe in God. And it is this belief without seeing that gives hope. And man has to live in this hope until he reaches heaven to see God. Now, this is quite interesting. How man has to live with hope. Hope is something that gives meaning to life. Man has to live with hope. And Robert Browning is a poet of love and hope. Now, continuing, Browning is the one who perfected the dramatic monologue. The dramatic monologue that was not invented by him, but he is the one who perfected the dramatic monologue. And one aspect which makes Browning popular is his use of the dramatic monologue form. As I told you, he was a man of vast reading. He had developed this habit from his very childhood, and that made him a thinker and also a poet. Another significant aspect of Browning's poetry is that he is a poet of man. The subject matter of his poems is about man. He writes about man, and it's not the physical aspects of man, the physical outlook or the physical aspects, but the inner man, what happens in his psychology. That is what Browning talks about in his poems. So he is a keen observer of man's life, man's psyche. Browning's poetic career can be divided into 6 stages. He emerged as a great poet, a noted poet, through these 6 stages. The first stage, that is from 1833 to 1840, this is the period in which he experiments with poetry. And he tried poetry and he thought of writing poems in various ways. So the poems of the first period are a few. He has written about 3 long poems during the period. One of them is Pauline. The second one is Sordello, and there is one more. Now, these long poems have the merits of true poetry, and even though they belong to the experimental period, they have the qualities of good poetry. Now the second period, 1841 to 1849. Now it is during this period that Browning selects the dramatic monologue as the most suitable form for his poems. He is basically an observer of man. Browning is an observer of man, and he observes what happens to the man, the psyche of the man. He selects characters from various life situations and studies them, and when we read his poems we understand how he peeps into or creeps into the lives of these characters and tries to understand, tries to grasp the working of his mind. So he found that in order to study the psychology of man, the best form would be the dramatic monologue. And he is not the one who has invented, but he perfected the dramatic monologue. Now see on the screen the next stage, the third stage, that is from 1850 to 1869. This is called the Italian period, and it is during this period that he came out with the best of his poems, the Italian period. Now, as a poet of nature, as a poet of love, as a poet of God, as a poet of hope, it is during this period that he gives to the world of literature the best of his work. He finds beauty in nature, he enjoys, and he describes the Italian background, the real beauty of the Italian landscape. He has been a traveler. He used to travel around. He has seen a number of places in the world, and he portrays them in his poems. Now basically the background we have in most of his poems is the Italian background, and therefore we call it the Italian period. The next stage is from 1870 to 1880. Here we find a change in the poet. He declines as a poet. Something happens. Now in the previous period there was a perfect balance of intellect, of vision, and of creativity. Now during this period, that is from 1870 to 1880, there we find the poet's intellect dominates over the other factors. So the artistic elements of poetry, they are kept aside, and the intellectual aspect begins to dominate. And as a result, his poems reduced to be poems. They were only ideas. They were only what he had, his thoughts. And it continued in the next stage also, that is from 1881 to 1887. The same attitude that continues. He becomes more of an intellectual, more of a debater. He debates, and the poetic elements, they disappear from his poems. So the characters in his poems during this period, they become mouthpieces of Robert Browning, and they spoke what he thought. And the last period, that is from 1888 to 1889, we find a coming back, a reawakening. Though it is only for a year, just 1 year, he comes back to the real Robert Browning, the real poet. He exhibits the poetic qualities once again. He mixes the thoughts, his philosophy, with the artistic elements. So this period is known as the Swan Song, and he wrote a beautiful poem during this period, which let us know that he returned to the real self as a poet. Now on the screen, Browning's concept of nature. What was Wordsworth's idea of nature? The Romantic writers, they depended on nature. They turned to nature for everything. Nature was everything for the Romantics. When they had problems in their lives, when disappointments overpowered them, when life seemed to be hopeless, the Romanticists would turn to nature and they would find solace, they would find comfort in nature. That's why Wordsworth sings, when the fretful fever unprofitable and the fever of the world have hung upon the beatings of my heart, how often have I turned to thee, O sylvan Wye, thou wanderer through the woods. That was Wordsworth. Wordsworth. Now, for the Romanticists, nature was that. They found God in nature, the God who protects, the God who consoles, the God who loves. That is what the Romanticists found in nature. Now, coming to Browning, belonging to the Victorian period, changes occurred in society, changes occurred in literature, changes occurred in politics. The industrialization and urbanization, moral decline, and increasing crimes changed the entire picture of England during the period of Robert Browning. Now, even though these political changes had less impact on Browning's beliefs, Browning's philosophy, there is a slight difference in the attitude or the approach to nature. Wordsworth believed that a common spirit breathed through nature and man. There is no difference between man and nature. There was a sympathetic union between man and nature. But for Browning, it was not so. He believed that there was no common spirit in nature and man. Nature is a separate entity. Nature is separate. Nature is different. Man is different. And nature is part of man's background. So nature happens to be man's background in Browning's poems. Whereas for Wordsworth, nature was everything. There was no difference between nature and man. Man was nature, nature was man, and the union. But here, nature becomes man's background. Now, Browning seems to say that there is no sympathy between man and nature. The sympathetic union, that is not always there. Sometimes nature becomes destructive. Nature can take a different turn. Nature can be hostile to man. So, the Wordsworthian concept of nature changes slightly when we come to the poetry of Robert Browning. Now, nature for Browning is a totally different concept, and he has written a number of poems based on nature, and we will see how he treats nature in his poems later on. Now, going further, it is essential to know Browning's view of human destiny. Now, what is the meaning of man's life? What gives meaning to life? That is very essential. Now, being a Christian, born and brought up in Christian background, he had a strong belief in God, and he believed what Christianity taught. God who is in heaven, who controls everything on the earth, and the predestination. Man has to live on the earth, and his life doesn't stop there, it continues. His life on earth makes him eligible for his life in the next world, that is with God. So, the life on earth is meaningful. That is meaningful, and that is a means to achieve the final, that is the life with God. So, Browning had a clear view of human destiny. He believed in the immortality of the soul. As a careful student of the human psyche, he was concerned about the soul of man, not the body. The body was secondary for him, but he was concerned more about the soul, the working of the inner soul of man. Now, he believed in immortality of the soul. So, the body is less important, but the richness, but the health of the soul, that is more important. And once we successfully complete life on the earth, we move towards the life in the other world. Another idea that he expresses through his poems is that success comes in heaven. So, success is not something that is achieved on the earth. Final success comes in heaven, and one has to make all efforts to find success in heaven. So, what a man is supposed to do on earth is to work hard and hard to be successful in heaven, because the life continues. The soul doesn't die, only the body dies, and the soul is carried forward. That is, the soul is taken to God for eternal life, and God in heaven is a person who rewards. So God appears in his poems as a person who rewards. So success surely comes in heaven. Man can be good or bad. All he needs to do is to work hard, and he surely is to be with God, and God is to reward him. Now, for him, two things are essential. One is efforts, the efforts that you put in, and the efforts are for the ideal. The efforts are for the ideal, and the efforts are towards achieving heavenly life or obtaining heaven. And the second is the nobility of the soul. So one has to work for the nobility of the soul. Soul matters, not the body. So make your life, live your life in such a way that you attain a nobility, a state of mind, a nobility. You are eligible, you become eligible for the life with God. Now, on the screen, man is destined to be great. Man has been created by God, the best creation of God. God who created man in his own image and blessed him with his love. And God wants him to love. So love is everything. God is love and man is to love. And man has to be great. man has to be great because he is the finest of his creations. But how to achieve this greatness? How man has to achieve this greatness? And this can be achieved through true love. So true love is the means through which greatness can be achieved. Now, true love, it is interesting to notice in his poems that man-woman relationship, the love between a man and a woman, it is not necessary that the man should love the woman and the woman should love him back. It is only necessary that if a man loves a woman, he has to love her with all his heart. And similarly, if a woman loves a man, she has to love with all her heart, and it should be pure love, it should be true love. And we find in most of his poems the love the man has for the woman does not succeed. So failures in love and disappointments of love, they occur again and again in his poems. And Robert Browning noticed, and he went into the psychology. He, being a keen observer, describes the aspects, the working of the human psyche when love fails. So greatness is achieved through true love. Even if it is love, a man has to work hard. He has to do his best for obtaining the heart of his beloved. And another important thing, what Browning considered vices are low aims, cowardice, and despair. So even in man-woman relationship, if one kept low aims, and if one did not show valor, courage, and if one is shrouded by despair, it becomes something ignoble. So low aims, cowardice, and despair are vices according to Robert Browning. Continuing, Robert Browning's poems very clearly expresses his view of art, what he thought of art. Now he seems to say that art is a means for self-expression. An artist has a quest for expression. He wants to show the world what he is, what he has in his mind. And art is a means for self-expression. Man has the desire to express himself, and art serves the purpose to express himself in the best possible manner. But an artist, who is the good artist? Not merely a craftsman. If you have the technical skills, that doesn't make you a good artist. A good artist needs to have a soul. That's the first requirement. A good artist should have a soul, a feeling soul, an understanding soul. And he should also have an insight and an inner illumination. So when all these things come together, a person becomes an artist. So first and foremost, he should have soul, and he should have an insight, and along with insight, he should have an inner illumination. And it is this inner illumination that makes him a good writer. So he can enrich the entire world through the words. So along with craftsmanship, art needs soul, insight, and inner illumination. Going further, the artist's life is an expression of the history of mankind. This is what we understand from Browning's poetry. Browning seems to say the artist's life, his own life is an expression of the history of mankind. History wants to be expressed, and it is an expression of the ideal. Similarly, the artist's life is also an expression of the history of mankind. Browning is a poet of love, and it is the treatment of love that makes him more interesting. Now, what did Browning do with the theme of love? He explored the disappointments and failures of love in his poems. Now, Browning had a happy life. He was happy with his wife. His married life was a success. There was no problem between Elizabeth and Robert Browning. They were quite happy. But when he turned to poetry, he showed more interest in exploring the disappointments and failures of the love relationships, because he might have felt that it is the psyche of the disappointed lovers that would be worth explaining in words through poetry. Now, love is such a feeling which is a combination of happiness and sorrow. This is a common fact. It's a general fact that love has two sides. It brings happiness, and it also gives some moments of sorrow. Now, Robert Browning is concerned with the passions. He is not much concerned with the passions. The physical appearance of the beautiful lover, or the strong romantic relationship between the man and the woman, the passion. Browning is not much interested in it. Whereas he shows his interest in diving into the feelings which the lovers feel in their heart. So the physical expressions are secondary, but what happens inside the lover's mind, that becomes more important. And he is exploring the inner world of the lovers, and the way he comes out with their feelings, and the way he selects characters and gives them voice. He gives them voice. That is quite interesting. So, of all the poems, what one feels is that Browning's love poems make him more and more interesting and well-read, a poet who forces the readers to read his poems. One of his best poems, love poems, is The Last Ride Together. There is a man and a woman in the poem. The man loves the woman so much. He expresses his love for his beloved, but she doesn't respond. She is negative. She is not ready to love him. So the picture we have in The Last Ride Together is the picture of a man who has been rejected by his lover. But his disappointment comes to an end when his beloved agrees to his request. he wanted to have a ride together, a last ride together before their separation. The woman, his beloved, is good enough. She agrees, and they start their journey, start their ride. Riding beside his beloved, he thinks about his love, and he is in a world of dreams. And towards the end, the thought comes to his mind that this is the moment that the poet, that the lover can have in his life, the best moment, because they can never be together. The woman is not ready to accept his love, and this is the best moment they can have, or the poet, the speaker can have, the character can have in his life, because he loves her so much. And a foolish thought comes to his mind: if the journey ends, if they die, what will happen? If they die, the journey doesn't end. So this is the highest point where they can be together. They cannot think of a life together, but now his disappointments have already disappeared, and now he thinks, now if they die, the journey will continue, and it becomes an eternal journey. So both of them will be moving towards heaven, where they will have their eternal life. So this is a beautiful poem by Robert Browning, The Last Ride Together. Now, one thing to notice is the love poems of Robert Browning have different characters in different situations. All the lovers are not of the same background. He has picked characters from various backgrounds with various temperaments, and is beautifully presenting their psychological world, their emotions, their feelings, their despair, their anxiety. So all these elements are beautifully described in his love poems. Now, a woman, when a man loves a woman, it can have two effects. A woman's love can have two effects on the man. Either the love can make him a noble man. So a woman's love ennobles a man. Or the other option is, if it doesn't ennoble, it may even cause his ruin. It may enmesh him in sensual slavery. So, analyzing the poems of Robert Browning, the love poems of Robert Browning, we find characters. We find different characters. For example, in one of the poems, By the Fireside, we find the poet who is just growing in age, wants to spend his life thinking about the precious time, the precious moments spent together with his beloved, with his wife, Elizabeth Browning. So that is one aspect. Either love can make man happy, make man noble. Otherwise, it can also destroy his life. And we find such a character, Andrea del Sarto. Andrea is a good artist, is a good painter. He has the skill, the technicalities. Nobody can challenge him. He is that kind of a character. But just against him, he has his wife, Lucrezia, a person who does not understand his feelings. And Andrea becomes a slave to her emotions, and that ruins his his artistic career. The French king's offer could not be completed. he is not able to come out of his miserable conditions. So this is the second effect of love, man-woman relationship. It can either make a man happy, make his life noble, or it can even destroy a man's life. On the screen, his idea of life and conviction of its relation with God appears in his poems. Now, I would like to speak about Browning's belief. He is a God man. Browning is a God man. He doesn't write anything without God. God is a fixed character in all his poems. Because God is the Almighty, God is the Supreme, and He is the All-Powerful, He is the Omniscient. God is the reality, and God is the final aim. So the conviction of God and the need of a perfect relation with God appears in all his poems. As I told earlier, maybe because of his social background, the family background, the Christian background, the religious beliefs, the deep-rooted religious beliefs and faith made him very close to God, and God appears in all his poems. Now, man's relation with God, it's not that a God who controls, a God who punishes, but more than that, Browning presents a God who is waiting for man, and man has to keep up the relationship with God, and then God will reward him. And God's authority is never questioned. Browning, in none of his poems, doubts God or questions his authority. Continuing, there are three things: power, knowledge, and love. These three things establish a communion between God and man. Now look at these words. These are terms: power, knowledge, and love. The supreme power is God. The source of knowledge is God. And the source of love is God. And the power, knowledge, and love of God is power, knowledge, and love find their way to the hearts of man. The God's power is shared. God's knowledge is shared. God's love is shared by man. And the soul within the man is nothing but God himself. That's the reason why Robert Browning is quite keen in analyzing the soul of man. So soul is also a key word for Robert Browning. The heart, the inner psyche, which he looks for in his characters, is actually a search for the soul. It is a search for the presence of God, how God works in that man. So when we read his poems, we understand that none of his poems end with a sad note. All the poems where the characters are unhappy, the characters are disillusioned, all the poems end with a note of hope. And why? Because God is the one who lives in the heart. God is powerful. When God is with us, there is nothing to fear. So the power of God, the knowledge of God, and God's love are shared by man, and they have in man's heart. So that's a perfect communion between man and God. And what makes the difference then? What makes the difference? And going back to the history of Adam and Eve, the creation, God created man in his own image and sent him to the Garden of Eden. And there was no difference between man and God. He was created in God's own image, and there was no sin. There was no difference. But it is then that sin entered in the form of Satan, and the sinfulness to which he became a slave made him inferior to God. So even though man fell from the heights, from the status of God, he came down to the earth. God hasn't abandoned him. So God is there in the heart, and the communion, the communication, and the sharing of the divine characters, the godly elements continues. Now let us see on the screen how Browning makes the psychoanalysis of his characters. As I just mentioned a few seconds ago, Browning's primary concern is the soul of man. What happens to the soul? He is least bothered about the physical aspects. And his keen interest in observing the psychology, the inner world of the people around. He did not believe much in subjectivity. He always suggested, always encouraged objectivity. So the working of the heart, the human soul, that was his primary concern. And when he wrote poems, he selected men and women who provided interesting studies in human psychology. Now it's worth noticing the characters in his poems. The men and women selected by Robert Browning, they provide interesting studies in human psychology. We have so many examples to cite. My Last Duchess, for example. We have the Duke, who has a live painting of the Last Duchess on the wall. He takes the envoy to the room where the Duchess painting has been displayed. And the people look at him in astonishment. And then he explains what happened. And just notice the way the Duke hates, his contempt for the Duchess, because she could not understand him. So that is one character. Now another example is Evelyn Hope. Here we have a very different character. A middle-aged man falling in love with a 16-year-old girl. This seems to be ridiculous. And I don't think in the 18th and 19th centuries anyone would encourage such a kind of relationship. The man who wants to be with the 16-year-old girl, he knows very well that their union is impossible. They cannot be together. And the girl dies, unfortunately. And when he sits near the dead body, he keeps up the hope that God, who is good, will grant his wish, and in heaven, the other world, they would live together. Another example is Porphyria's lover, a different character. Here we have a lover, Porphyria's lover, who is very happy, who is at the peak of happiness when Porphyria approaches him and shares her love, and that is the happiest moment in his life, and he doesn't want to lose that moment, and in order to keep that love forever, he kills her. And then Robert Browning says, when he kills her, God doesn't say a word. So he deliberately writes these lines. God doesn't say a word. That means, why should God be angry? Has he done something wrong? He killed his beloved because he did not want to see a decline in the love. Then the last ride together. Another example. The lover who knew that his love is never going to be successful takes up the journey, and how he wishes to continue the journey eternally. Another example is Andrea del Sarto, how he became a slave, how he could not succeed. Another aspect, another figure, totally different. And another example is a grammarian's funeral. A grammarian is dead. He lived a good life. He was not much interested in the pleasures of the world because he knew that there is a life after that. His life would be completed in the other world. So he was preparing himself for the life in the other world. So all these poems have different kinds of characters, and what the poet does is he is just going into them and coming out with their heart, what happens in their heart. So his poems have these characteristics, and he becomes a perfect psychoanalyst. And finally he brings out so beautifully, he comes to the same end. After analyzing all these characters, he comes to the same end, that is the nobility of the soul, the making of the soul, how the soul is made. So all these characters, all these situations come to one particular point, that of the soul. When we consider Browning's poetry, there are so many important characteristics to be discussed. But basically, what one notices is his treatment of love, his love poems, how he connects love, God, nature and man. Man's relationship with nature, man's relationship with God, and God and nature. So how all these elements are interrelated. They are rather synonyms. So God, man, nature and love. Another significant thing with which I would like to conclude is the treatment of art. He has written poems about poetry, about poets. He has written poems about artists like painters and musicians, about music and also about painting. Now he places music on the top because according to him, the music is the sound of God. So music has the effect to take us to God. And painting, what about painting? There are characters, Andrea and the friar. So the poems of Browning open up to various areas which make his study more and more interesting, and I hope we will enjoy reading his poems. Thank you.
SANDHAN. All Gujarat integrated classroom.
સેટેલાઇટના માધ્યમથી જોડતી કડી એટલે સંધાન.